Hi, this is Annie Fox with Family Confidential, Secrets of Successful Parenting. My guest today is Dr. Patrick M. Duffy Jr. Dr. Duffy is a licensed clinical psychologist and the author of the new book, Parenting Your Delinquent, Defiant, or Out of Control Teen. Hi, Patrick. Welcome to Family Confidential.
Hi, Annie. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for writing this important book. And I'm thinking about how challenging teenage years are for the teens and for their parents as well. And here you have focused on a subset of that challenging population, maybe even the most challenging, talking about delinquent
Right.
and out of control teens. So can you please tell me briefly, how did you get involved in what is probably really challenging work?
Well, I always, way back, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I always enjoyed working with kids, and went to work for Department of Mental Health here locally, and I was working in an alternative school for this population, and I really enjoyed it. There was something about them and their spirit and working with them and the gains that you see when, sometimes they're small, but it's rewarding when you can see someone do well, whether it's they get a job or whether they're doing better in school, getting along better with their family. It's just an opportunity to really make a difference, and I find it to be an enjoyable population.
Well, I'm really glad there are people, thoughtful people like you who are working with them because I know they need a lot of work and the parents do too. I can imagine that it would be extremely frustrating to feel as a parent that your words are not being heard, that you're being defied right and left. And I know there's probably a lot of research that's happened recently that is maybe changing some of the thinking behind the causes of this kind of behavior for the teens. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering how you bring that research to the parents who need it most.
Well, you're right. There's a lot of research that's out there as far as what's contributing to the behavior. And a lot of what happens with families and parents is they're not really sure where the behavior comes from. They're
Yeah.
frustrated and they're trying to make a difference, and all they see is the behavior continue, and they don't have an understanding of why. So, what the research allows us to do is explain the behavior. Essentially, we can look at each child and see how it plays into their particular circumstances. And we're just saying that under these conditions, we can predict that this child's going to do this. And so by being able to lay out what those conditions are, it helps explain the behavior, but it also gives a roadmap to the parents of, well, if we can start to change some of these influences on the child's behavior, we would expect to see some behavior change. And so it really gives them some sense of hope that they've got some power to control some of those things and to change the behavior.
And I would imagine in talking to the teens as well, you give them a sense of what they can control in terms of the environment, their triggers, and the choices that they make.
Absolutely. And, I think that giving them, for some, it may be skills, for some, seeing that they've got some opportunities to do well. For others, it may just be having people reinforce the appropriate behavior. It makes me think of, one child that was out of school and had been out of school for several weeks, and it was hard to get the child going back to school. She felt really alone. And in being able to explain that, we're able to get somebody, in this case, a school principal, was willing to meet the child and greet her at the door and say, "Hey, I'm
Mm.
glad you're here. Let me walk you to your class." And so it just depends on what it is and valuing what the child says as well. And we really try and bring the parents into anything like that. So the parent then is going to be in touch with the school principal to make sure everything's going well, just kind of having those influences all work together.
So, in terms of nature versus nurture, early signs, and how parents can distinguish between a child having a meltdown at age 2 versus what starts to become a pattern of obstinacy, what kind of guidelines can you help us with?
There are definitely kids that have different temperaments
Mhm.
and they bring something else to the equation from another kid. What we tend to see is that kids that end up being falling into the delinquency pattern later in life start earlier and they may start getting in trouble. They lack social skills And in situations that maybe could be managed better by somebody about their age, they may respond aggressively. And what we see is that they get marginalized at a younger age, and they may get pushed into special ed classes and things like that, where they're surrounded by other kids with the same behaviors or skill deficits or whatever it may be for them. And it sets them on a trajectory really to be associating with the other kids that are marginalized and getting in trouble. And what the research tells us is that the biggest predictor of juvenile delinquent behavior, or the most direct, is who they're hanging around with. And so if they're being pushed into those special classes early, we're kind of setting them up for that later on.
So what I hear you saying is that maybe the idea of specialized classes for kids who have quote unquote issues is not the best approach in your estimation?
That's a great question. And, I think that it's really, and in saying that, I'm going to be sure that I narrow it down to the delinquency population.
Okay.
There are certainly things that may fit for other kids, but what the research tells us on delinquency is that the biggest predictor is who they hang around with. And if you look at what we do with that population, we tend to force that association with delinquent peers, whether we put them in different classes, sometimes specialty schools, or different group treatments. We're actually forcing them to hang around in the peer situations that we know predict offending.
Okay, I'm going to take the point of view of a teacher who has like 25 or 28 kids in his or her class. And there's this one kid who's just always disruptive, challenging boundaries, and the rules don't apply to him or her. And from the teacher's perspective, their happiest day is when that kid is not there.
Right.
They complain to the principal, and nothing seems to happen. From the teacher's perspective, and let's get real here. To help this child, what would you recommend?
What we find is that, first of all, absolutely understanding the teacher's feelings. It's exhausting work to begin with, and you add in a behavior problem, and it's just tiring. The most effective thing for the child would be, rather than put them in a setting where they're surrounded by other kids that are getting in trouble, we may make some adjustments in where they sit in the classroom, so that they're not surrounded. Yeah. So maybe they're not surrounded by the kids that are egging them on right now. But a lot of what happens for teachers is that they don't feel supported by home. They're working in a silo, and home's doing what they're doing. So the most effective strategy is to have them on the same page and try and get the family and the school working well together on a coordinated plan with frequent communication, whatever the frequency of the behavior tells us that it needs to be. But we know that the one thing everybody wants is for this child to do well and succeed.
Yeah.
And so if we can get them working together where school feels more supported by what's happening at home, and home can reinforce the situation in school, we're going to get better results for that child than we are if we surround them by kids that think what they're doing is great.
And where does the child fit into this team effort?
If we can get the child on board, that's fantastic. Part of what we want to do is identify things for the child that, they may, for them, it might be, I want my parents to stop yelling at me. And,
I think most kids would agree that they would like less of that. So
right.
let's start with what we can all agree on as a good goal.
Absolutely. And then, okay, well, what's it going to take to have that happen? And, here are the rules. But also, that gives us some insight into what's happening with the family. I don't want parents yelling at the child, and they don't want to do it either. Right. And what we know is that what they've been doing hasn't been very effective. Right. So I would want to get them to do something different that's going to be more effective, that doesn't rely on the yelling. Part of what we would look for, again, would be some reinforcement that might be desired by the child. Certainly their input on what's effective there is going to make a difference. They also give us some input on what's happening in the classroom. Mm-hmm. If there is a particular peer that's pushing their buttons, then the child's the only one that may know that, and that's helpful information. So they're a part of this system, and we need to have their input as well. It's also true that a lot of times they don't like it because they're having a good time with their friends, and so it's one where as much as we can get them engaged in it, the better. But what we're talking about doing is making changes around the child so that the behavior is no longer supported. And so their love for what we're doing isn't absolutely necessary.
Let's talk about some changes within the child. What percentage of the population you work with have other issues? Diagnostic tests are seeming to reveal many more cases of things like ADHD, attention
Mhm.
and learning issues that can make it really difficult for children who don't necessarily have a combative temperament to succeed in class. But if you add that on top of this temperament you're talking about, can be extremely challenging. So where does ADHD, for example, fit into this population?
Right in the center. One
Okay.
of the things that we know about, if you look at the research on ADHD, what it tells us is that if the child is indeed ADHD, it's really important that they have a very structured environment. That's not different from what we're talking about now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really blends in directly. And as you say, there's a lot of overlap in ADHD, conduct disorder. They get thrown together a lot, or they show up together a lot, I should say. But yeah, it's very much the same. Part of what we want to do is first, we want to be very clear in what the expectations are. More frequent reinforcement or feedback on the behavior. Let them know very clearly what they can expect. And, for a case like that, the child and their ability to slow down their impulses comes into play too. So part of what we might need to do would be work with them on some skills to slow down and stop being so impulsive. How do they stop and think? A lot of things that are already done,
Mm-hmm.
but we just might build into where that's part of what's tracked at school. So that maybe if the teacher sees the child using one of the strategies that we taught, there's a reinforcement for that. We may also work with the teacher. Part of what happens with ADHD kids is they really aren't aware of what they're doing sometimes, when they're moving and disruptive.
Right.
And so if we're able to get the teacher just to give the prompt of, hey, whether it's a hand signal or whatever it might be, so that you don't embarrass the child,
Good point.
that this may be a time to try the strategy. And, so if it brings it then to mind and they're able to do it, great, that's a success. And let's build in some reinforcement for that.
Yeah, I would also note that parents can also do that very discreet signal when they're at home or in public with their child, so that it doesn't escalate and become a
Mm-hmm.
shouting match or a power trip back and forth, and the kid is spared from public shaming.
Completely agree. And that's one of the things that when we talk about discipline or teaching child skills, we can predict that if it's done in front of friends or if it's done, in public like that, it's probably not going to go very well.
No.
And so part of what we work with families to do is to schedule when you're going to do it. That's all in your control. And if you're out in public, whether it's that you tug at your ear or something like that, that's discreet, and the child knows, hey, you may want to try whatever the strategy is that's been
Mm-hmm.
agreed upon. You don't call the child out in public and embarrass them.
Now I'm thinking you probably work closely with parents about their buttons getting pushed so that they can self-regulate as well.
Hmm. Yeah, the kids are good at that,
Oh
and
yeah.
and so yeah, I think for this to be effective, parents, there are things that get in their way of doing the things that we would like them to do. One is kids are very good at pushing their buttons. One of the things that we know about that in interactions among people in general is that they tend to follow particular patterns and or particular sequences. And so parents can identify and predict where it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I know when I tell my child that he can't go to the party this weekend, that he's likely to start yelling at me and it's going to escalate. So if they go in being prepared for that and they can predict it, they can remove themselves a little bit easier from the scenario before everybody's anxiety is up and it becomes an emotional situation. There are also those cues, and parents recognize them. They get to a point in the process where they're saying, "Here we go again,"
Yeah.
and so they recognize the cues that the sequence is building up, and so at that point, maybe they can get themselves out of the situation.
Or at
We
the
may also adjust it where, for example, maybe there's a neighbor or a spouse or whoever it might be that can be a support.
to be there and help them flag, hey, all right, you said what you need to say. Now let's get out of here before it escalates into an argument that nobody wants.
That's really, really good advice. That's good for parents of any teen, any kid. Those button-pushing moments rarely put us at our best parenting.
Right, absolutely.
So if there was one takeaway you could have for my viewers and listeners about parenting this challenging group of teens or parenting teens in general, what would that be, Patrick?
I think that parenting, well, the challenging or in general, number one is, you said one.
Oh, go ahead.
But, I think that they need to understand that they've got more power than they think they have. They're the most powerful people in the child's life. And that the kids still seek their approval. And so that they can set clear ideas for what they want to see happen, and they've got the ability to enforce it. One of the biggest things, if we're talking about the delinquent population, is where they go and who they spend time with. Maybe they get home by 9 o'clock or whatever curfew time is, but if they were out with the delinquent group, you can still get in a lot of trouble before 9 o'clock. So we want them to be aware of that. And, it's a pretty daunting task too. Sometimes it's exhausting work. And, the old statement of it takes a village, but, who's there that can help you, whether it's just to pick up the phone and answer when you're having a tough day or encourage you saying, I know you're having a tough time, but you're doing the right thing. Or who can help monitor, the child after school if you're working 2 jobs.
That's interesting that you say that about the village. And what came to mind instantly is sometimes when I'm in the checkout stand at the supermarket and I see a parent being challenged by usually a young child. Mm-hmm. Right there at the moment, they're hungry, it's time to get home for dinner, and the kid is doing something that typically mom doesn't like. When she responds in a way that I know is helpful, I just give her a look and I go, good parenting.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's nice when you see them do that, and that they're being strong in the face of what's a tough situation for them.
Yeah, and I think that kind of reinforcement, especially since so many people feel judged by other parents in public when their kids are not behaving perfectly, it really helps to just, I'd say this to all of us who are parents, just to have an appreciation that just because the kid is acting out doesn't mean you've got a bad parent. In fact, they're doing their best, and it would be really helpful if you could just lend a little support.
I think that's a great point. The self-doubt comes into play. You're there, you're embarrassed because your child's yelling in the grocery store, and you just say, "Oh, let me get out of here." But if the people there are supportive of what you're doing, that's a great vote of confidence.
Yeah, it only needs to be a sympathetic look exchanged with the mom. It doesn't need to be a whole thing, and mom will get it. That's really, really cool. Okay, Patrick. Well, we've got just about 1 minute left, and I'd love for you to take this time as an opportunity to give our viewers and listeners some information about where they can find more resources from you.
All right. My book is available on Amazon. They can find me on my website at drpatrickmduffy.com. I'm also available on Twitter at pduffypsych, and available through my publisher as well, through New Harbinger Publications. And certainly happy to respond to anything that you send me. I appreciate your time.
Well, I certainly appreciate the work that you're doing. It's important for parents to feel supported, and teachers as well. And it's very important for kids to feel that the adults who live and work with them really care.
Absolutely. And thank you.
This is Annie Fox for Family Confidential. To learn more about my work with parents of tweens and teens, visit anniefox.com. And check out my parenting book, Teaching Kids to Be Good People, Progressive Parenting for the 21st Century. And my new book for tween girls, the Girls Q&A book on friendship, 50 Ways to Fix a Friendship Without the Drama. And if you like this podcast, and we hope you do, please consider rating us on iTunes. It may seem like a little thing to you, but it will mean an awful lot to us. Family Confidential podcast is produced by Electric Eggplant, creators of books and apps for parents, kids, tweens, and teens. And tune in next time when my guest will be Catherine Ellison. Catherine is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of the new book, ADHD, What Everyone Needs to Know. Until next time, happy parenting.